Well, our shadow is just literally, in simple terms, it's just literally all the stuff we repress because of the conditioning of the early years. So anything that we're just not conscious of, that we've been told has been unacceptable, will get put away in what we call our shadow. And shadow work becomes reconnecting to those parts that we have repressed, because in that lies a lot of energy.
This is Let Love Begin, a podcast for the recovering brokenhearted, ready to heal and reclaim their enthusiasm. Have you ever found yourself stuck in your relationship, or you just don't seem to be able to reach the level of intimacy that you're looking for? You're just really struggling to connect to your partner. Well, you might have some unconscious factors at play that may be hindering your ability to connect with your partner on a deeper level. And today, that's what we'll be talking about. Today, Sandra Harewood, a psychotherapeutic counselor, couples counselor, and coach, will shed some light on the unconscious barriers to intimacy and what she calls our shadow side and how it affects relationship dynamics. And she's going to offer some valuable tools and strategies to help us realize and understand what may be going on for us. I really love this episode. Sandra's got a really amazing energy, and I really feel like there's a lot of value in this one. So, as always, with all our episodes, take what works for you and leave what doesn't. But I think you're going to get a lot out of this one. Welcome, Sandra. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for asking me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Me too. So today we're going to be talking about ways that we might be blocking intimacy. So you
Hmm.
work with lots of couples and individuals. What are three really common ways that we might be blocking intimacy in our relationships?
Okay, well, the way we actually block intimacy is 9 times out of 10, it's completely unconscious because um, 80 to up to 95% of the time we're operating from an unconscious place. And what we do is in just very subtle ways, we see our partner not as they really are, but either how we want them to be or as an image from someone from our past, or we see them as carrying parts of ourselves that we're not really connected to. So, what that all means is we're not actually seeing this person as they are, and therefore we can't really connect to them truly as who they are on a soul level, because we're unconsciously making it up. So, in those kind of three subtle ways, either by what we call transference, which is either is making them someone else, projection, which is projecting all the stuff that we do not like about ourselves onto them and making them responsible for it, or something else slightly different, which is when we actually internalize all the stuff that they're throwing our way. It just means that all creates a block because we're not seeing that person as who they are, and we're not allowing them to see us as who we are. And that's not a recipe for intimacy, because intimacy, if we break it down, is in to me see, right? It's really allowing someone to looking to us on a kind of deeper level and being open to see them, warts and all, for who they are. So if we look at intimacy that way, in literally break it down into me see, we're putting up all these kind of subtle unconscious barriers. We can't really be as intimate as we think we are.
So if it's unconscious then and that's happening, how do we know?
So that's a good question. Well, we can begin to know when we just observe ourselves, right? And just notice our patterns and become really super aware of how we're showing up with that person. A really big way of knowing is when we connected to our emotional reactivity. Right. So when we are having an emotional response, we get to check out the intensity of it and whether that intensity feels proportional to what's actually going on. If it isn't, that's a real clue that in that space of actually, is there more here? We can actually begin to think about what that more is, right? So any form of emotional reactivity is usually a clue that there is something that our conscious mind is not connected to. So that's a real big way. Another, and when I say emotional activity, a kind of strand of that is when in our partner, we really don't like something about what they're doing. We really know that, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't behave like that. You're doing something that I wouldn't do. All those are really subtle clues that there's something within us that we're projecting out onto them.
Is it possible? Because when you were speaking, I was like, this images of this ex came up. So
Okay.
I'm going to use him as a case study for myself.
Right.
But are there moments where you can connect and have intimacy, and then you can kind of fall out of it in the same relationship? Like you can have glimpses?
Say more.
Well, this particular person that I'm thinking of, exactly what you said, like he would overreact with these huge things. And it was definitely a clue that there was something underlying there. And this person was traumatized for sure. But this was prior to me realizing that. And I was like, because it just doesn't make sense. Like the trigger is definitely not as out of proportion the reaction was. But then there'd be times where it was very connected and intimate and it was a very volatile relationship because it was really dependent on how their mood was. Is that like a different thing or is that part of the same thing?
Well, it's part of the same thing. So I suppose there's two things really. One, the way that I approach this is that I think we begin with self first. I think often we're super focused on the other person. We give them not more attention than they deserve, but actually, I think our work is to focus on ourselves and to notice on what is going on for us in that moment and really notice when that person is behaving in that way. What am I doing? Because if they are being overreactive, then that's information for us, right? In terms of what keeps me in this relationship? Am I tapping into my own fear? Am I tapping into my own sense of insecurity? What am I tapping into me that keeps that dynamic going? So I think when we see someone else behaving that way, one, it's an opportunity to look at ourselves and maybe, what are we projecting onto them? Because this is the stuff that's on hidden. What are they holding that we're not able to hold? Maybe in terms of being able to express emotion. So hear me, this isn't a kind of pass for people to behave appropriately. It really isn't. It's really to look at actually how am I in relationship to them? Because when we're studying somebody else, we can't control what they're doing and then we lose control of the situation. So I think it's always good to come back to self. And of course, we can have moments of intimacy because no one is one thing,
Mm.
right? No one's going to be one thing all the time. So, of course, we can have moments of intimacy. I suppose the question is, are those moments enough? How much of that nourishment are you actually getting for the relationship? So, I would say, yes, of course you can, but it really is perhaps looking at the bigger picture. How often are those moments coming? And two, as I said, bringing it back to self, because if we're not getting the nourishment that we need in the relationship, then we have to think about either what's keeping us in the relationship, what's making it difficult to be ready to move on, or what we want to do next.
That's good advice. Very good advice. And the answer is no, they weren't enough.
Well, then I think it's important to notice because sometimes we can be in relationships and hold on to those moments of intimacy. And I always say, if we're used to our cup being, whichever way you want to say it, half full or half empty, but if we're used to a certain scarcity or lack in a relationship, if we have a story of not receiving or feeling good enough in relationships, then the vulnerability is that any intimacy, just any drop will feel like our cup is overflowing when actually it's a drop.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction to make. Thank you for mentioning that. So you said the three unconscious ways were projection, transference, and the other one was
And the other one is what we call projective identification. It's a long-winded way of saying is what are you consciously absorbing? So when someone projects because when your partner projects what you were talking about in your ex and those moments of reactivity, what in some instances we absorb of that and actually we end up behaving the way that they say we are when actually it's not really our true self.
wow, interesting. Okay. So let's talk about how do these three things, how do they manifest? So projections, I know we've talked about that a little bit, and people say that all the time. Oh, they're just projecting. I hear that all the
Well,
time.
yeah, well, we hear it all the time because actually we all do it and we all do it all the time. I think we commonly might think about it with narcissistic behaviors, but actually we're all projecting all the time. I mean, what it means is that um, so we as children would have grown up learning that certain things are either unacceptable or acceptable in our lives, and that will come from our families, our communities, our culture. There will be these kind of conscious and written and unwritten rules about this is the way to behave. And anything that we believe is not acceptable, that if we behave in that way, we're not going to get the love and attention and appreciation, all that stuff we need in our lives, then we kind of lock those away. And that can be positive stuff as well as things that are not so negative. So, what we might push away into what we call our shadow, it might be anger, or equally, it might be something positive. It might be creativity. If our parents taught us that, you don't get anywhere in life if you want to be an artist or creative, or, we might dim our light, as another way of saying, in that respect. So all of that gets locked away. And so what happens is our adult relationships are the places that those things once again come to the surface. But what we do is that we see it in the other person. What we can't see no longer see in ourselves, we see in other person. So in a positive way, that might be, we might say, oh my goodness, this person's a fantastic business person. I could never be like that. And we find ourselves really drawn and attracted to them. When actually there's a little seed in us that might be want to express that. Equally, we might find ourselves in relationships where our partners express things that we are finding more difficult, such as anger. And we might say, oh, they're always angry, they're always complaining, they're always blah, 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 blah. But really, it's an opportunity to kind of think, okay, what in me am I making about the other person, right? So it's not just negative stuff, it's anything that when we find ourselves overly kind of idolizing or putting someone on a pedestal, or equally saying, that they're really terrible. It's an opportunity to kind of look within, because that's within our shadow. And there are gifts in that, right? So it's not literally the opposite. So if someone's really angry, it doesn't mean that we go around behaving like that. It just means we might struggle to access that angry energy, which means that we might not set good boundaries, right? Because boundaries come from wanting to protect our space. And at the root of anger is wanting to protect oneself. Now, there are ways in which we express it, and there's a spectrum. But somewhere on there is actually, how do I assert myself? How do I set good boundaries? How do I say no when I don't want to do something? How do I risk someone thinking, oh, she's not a nice person, because I'm asserting myself, because I'm saying no, because I'm not being the nice girl, right? But of course, in a partnership, what happens is if we're always saying to the other person, you're angry or you're not nice, and that can translate into blaming, to blame and shame, right? It's all about them. And it might mean that we're not actually looking at ourselves and how we are participating in some of the unhealthy cycles in a relationship.
You said something about a shadow side. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, our shadow is just literally, in simple terms, it's just literally all the stuff we repress because of the conditioning of our early years, right? So anything that we're just not conscious of, that we've been told has been unacceptable, will get put away in what we call our shadow. And shadow work becomes reconnecting to those parts that we have repressed, because in that lies a lot of energy. So it's easier to think about it from the positive side, I think, because we can repress a lot of gifts Children who thought they could be good singers or creatives don't do it anymore, and they go in and they work in the corporate world and they don't really like it, and the soul's not really connected to it. Some part of them has been repressed. And our work is to befriend that and bring it into consciousness. It's more difficult with the difficult stuff, right? It's more difficult to think of ourselves being complaining, or that we might have I say anger because anger comes up a lot in relationships, when couples avoid it, when they avoid having healthy conflict because what they're afraid of is actually expressing healthy anger. So I mention that a lot because it's a big thing, and that does get in the way of intimacy, because if you can't tell your partner what's going on in your mind because you're fearful of either their anger or actually secretly fearful of your own, that's a major intimacy blocker. So that's why I mention it quite a lot.
Interesting. Okay. So, yeah, a lot of people do avoid conflict. I think also because, yeah, maybe because they don't trust themselves. They don't know how to fight. They don't know how to express what they're saying without getting angry.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm curious about is, if all of these things are subconscious, how do we begin that shadow work? How do we bring those things into the light to be able to kind of sift through them?
The super first thing is just noticing how you are, noticing your own reactivity, noticing how you're feeling. Because for sure, anytime we're having an emotional reaction to something, it's a clue
Mm.
of something within, because it's tapping on a sense of, I can't do that, I'm not allowed to do that. It's something within our psyche is being touched at that moment. So emotional reactivity is the number one way of noticing and getting curious, because that's what the starting point is. It's one is being self-aware, and two, when we notice this stuff, it's just getting curious. I wonder what that might be about. But we have to be able to really, as I said, with the golden shadow or the light shadow, which is all the good stuff, it's easier to do, right? Because we can say, oh, maybe I can run a successful business. Maybe I have charisma. Maybe I have charm. Maybe within me there is a good artist. There is a creative. Those things might be easier to access than the more challenging things, which might be, maybe I can be angry. Maybe I can be manipulative.
Mm.
Maybe I can be unkind. Maybe I can be empathic. Those are the things that are more challenging, but there are gifts in those things, because sometimes, or lazy, right? I mean, lazy is a good example, because if we can attach to our lazy energy, attach to our lazy energy, maybe we rest, maybe we take time out, maybe we take a pause instead of being rushing, 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 rushing. So lazy is a good one, right? Because if we're looking at other people and thinking, oh, they're lazy, they're not pulling their weight. So here's the truth. Maybe they're not, maybe that's true. So it's not about airbrushing away what the other person is doing. It's just noticing our response in reaction to it. And then we get curious, because are we the person rushing around doing everything? Are we the one overcompensating in a relationship and doing everything? Are we
Mm.
the one that's really exhausted and burnt out? And actually, if we had just a little bit of that lazy energy, what would self-care look like? What would rest look like? What would replenishment look like? That's an example that, it's not about airbrushing what somebody's doing. They're behaving a certain way. We still have to engage with how they're behaving. But what we look about is how we feel about that.
Yeah, that's a really, really great example as well. I love that. Because, yeah, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, yeah, that person does nothing, or they're so lazy. And it's like, well, maybe you just do too much. I
Mm,
know a lot of people who really struggle with rest, actually.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah. And
Mm.
it's interesting as well. It's almost like they get their worth from constantly being busy and like,
Yes, absolutely. Right. And I suppose that comes to the other part of childhood, as you know, I imagine that alongside it's not okay to rest would have come some story somewhere about actually I do need to. My worth is attached to my doing. If I do something, if I helped mum, or if I helped dad, whatever I was doing, when was I getting praise and support for the fact that I was doing? And so that carries through into the adult relationship. And then we find ourselves very resentful because we are the ones doing everything when actually it's an invitation to think. And that's the hard work also, because if we spent a lifetime being attached to the idea that we do have to be busy, then actually it's going to feel really strange.
And exhausting.
But also to slow down
Right.
is going to really trigger something, isn't it? Because it might be, oh my goodness, I don't feel valuable anymore. Or no one's going to think I'm important anymore. And so that becomes the edge in terms of what would it be like to do something different and slow down and ask your partner to do something and set
And,
good boundaries around that.
and stick to them.
Absolutely, because that's the hard part with boundaries, isn't it? We think that boundaries is just saying something and then leaving it down to the other person to do what they're doing, when actually the work of boundaries, much of it is the follow through.
Well, hey there, it's Talia here, and I wanted to take a quick break to let you know that I started this podcast when I went through my most significant breakup. And what really helped me at the time was listening to other people's stories of healing and how they transformed through their breakup. That really helped me understand what I was going through and really gave me hope that I could get there too. Before this podcast, I created an online summit where I interviewed 21 experts talking about different aspects of breakups and how we can let go of our ex and begin to open our hearts again. It's called the Let Love Begin Summit. And if you're interested in watching or listening to the summit, you can go to rebellove.com/summit and use the code podcast for 20% off. It's usually just $21, which is $1 per interview, but you can get it for around 16-ish using the code podcast. I hope you get as much out of it as I got making it. Okay, back to the episode. So you've talked a lot about noticing your behavior and noticing what comes up for you. And what's interesting for me when you're speaking is I'm flicking through kind of past files in my head of, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes I'll meet someone and for some reason they'll just rub me the wrong way. They haven't done anything wrong. And I'm always really curious about that. I'm always like, what is it about them that I'm finding irritating or something like that? And I guess it's what you're saying. There's something unconscious there that
Mm.
it must be triggering because some reactions happening in me that is very not typical for me. I don't normally think those things. I don't normally have those thoughts. So it's like, what is it about this particular person that's causing this reaction? So how do these unconscious barriers to intimacy impact our communication and emotional connection between our partners or even our friends and family members?
Yeah, well, it'll be everybody, right? Because we're doing it all the time. But I think with our partners, I mean, if we're not seeing them as who they are, then when we're communicating with them, in some levels, we may be communicating with ourselves. So if it's projection and, we're saying, you're lazy, but actually that's our deeper fear, we're going to be speaking with that fearful energy, right? And because we're not accepting it in ourselves, we're for sure not going to accept it with them. So this is where kind of blame and judgment can creep in other ways, in terms of like within transference, when we are literally unconsciously see. I don't know if you have this on Australia, but in the UK we have these masks. So like when there's like with the coronation, or I'm thinking about it with the royal family, because people will go out and they'll get these masks. It's like a mask of a face, and the eyes are cut out so you can see, and the mouth's cut out so you can speak. But actually, you've got this mask on, and in the moment you're Prince Harry, in the moment you're Beyonce, in the moment whoever you are. But in a way, that's what happens in our relationships. That in these kind of subtle, unconscious moments, we are seeing our partner as someone else, not as who they really are. And that may be images from our past. It might be a parent, we might be speaking to our partner, but actually they're reminding of us a parent. And so the energy, the words that are coming out of our mouth may be very relevant to what's going on in the here and now, but the energy may well be loaded with what actually something we really wanted to say to a parent, but we never did. But our partner's getting not only what may well be appropriate in the here and now. You broke a promise. You didn't do what you say you were gonna do, right? That may well be true in the moment, but the energy of it may well be loaded with past disappointment, past hurt, which can be from a previous relationship also, right?
Right.
But it can also be from younger years. So that means that something gets hyped up, something gets energized, and we're making our partner responsible to respond to us in a way that maybe they can't because it's all of the stuff that's coming their way isn't about them. And so we're never going to feel satisfied because something's going to feel incomplete. Something's going to feel unfinished because it's not about them.
Wow, I feel like you'd have to be pretty aware to kind of get that in the moment and also for your partner to get that, and it could be a real explosion if you don't.
Well, I think that's another way of looking at intimacy, right? Because I think all of this, whether it's shadow work or whether it's catching ourselves in these moments of transference, because we all do it, it's about practice,
Right.
it's about patience. And when you've got two people who are, willing to do this work together, it can be a real gateway to mutual healing of your past wounds. So it's not an on-off switch. But I think actually, in and of itself, it is about growth. It is about healing. When you can say to your partner, "Oh, this is what's going on for me,"
Right.
and they might not understand it, but they might not get it. But are they open to listening?
Right.
When someone can say, "I'm really sorry. And it might not be in the moment. It might be the next day, right? I'm really sorry. I've thought about it, and actually, that wasn't really about you. That was about something else." I think that actually fosters intimacy because you're opening up the vulnerability of the hurt that's gone on in the past. You're willing to be patient with each other. You're willing to practice. Neither of those things, as I said, means that we tolerate things that are not appropriate, but it allows us actually to step into more assertiveness and set more
Mm.
boundaries. And I think boundaries, actually, we can look at those in terms of intimacy, right? Because when someone says, actually, this is not good for me, so, or I don't want to do this, or this is not okay with me, or even not now, and the other person respects that, they really are seeing you. So I think that's just another way of thinking about, boundaries that actually, and we're actually expressing something of ourselves, right? We're actually being clear. And I think that we can look at boundaries as intimate moments as well.
I think there's a lot of power in that, coming to someone and saying, I had to think about it and that wasn't actually about you. That, that acknowledging that takes a lot of courage and
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you know the Brene Brown marble jar analogy, but
Okay,
it's like she talks about like little, like every time something positive happens is like, yeah, everyone has this marble jar and it's like the positive moments go into the marble jar
absolutely. Yeah,
and equally they get taken out. It's like the positivity bank or I guess the intimacy bank in this instance.
yeah, because that's right. Because I think, as I said, it's not none of this is about enduring or things that you don't have to. So I suppose that equates to the taking something out of the jar. But I think, equally, just putting things into the jar and seeing how it grows. And I suppose that comes back to what we're talking about. Are you getting enough nourishment? Yeah, because if you're taking more out of the jar than you're putting in, then, it's a sign. But we have to be kind of really aware of ourselves, I think. Often when I work with couples, one of my role as a therapist, I think, is to really catch the moments when something's been put in the jar, because often they don't see it. They miss the moments where, a marble could have been put in there. And that's part of the self-awareness as well, because then you'd be able to kind of more tune into those moments. And that's about tuning into gratitude as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and acknowledging yourself, but also acknowledging them when nice thing happens, because that's definitely a marble in the jar.
Yes, absolutely.
So, besides noticing our own behavior and our own reactions when things happen, not only with our partner, but I guess the example I used before where someone just rubs you the wrong way or like really noticing what's happening inside, are there any other techniques or exercises that we can practice to kind of um, notice our part in the intimacy dynamic?
Okay, well, I think those are the main ones. The other things that I work with, which are more kind of ongoing things. If you dream, so I work dreams as well, that our dreams to give us messages. And oftentimes we will dream about our shadow parts. All this unconscious material will come up at night and dreams. And so actually when we dream of, this is a generalization, but if we dream of someone who is of the same sex as us in a dream, then usually that is an indication of a shadow part. So you get to notice what is our ego self, our dream self doing, and how are we relating to this other person in the dream, because that will give us information. And it will tell us, if that person is doing something completely outrageous or something very different to what we ourselves would not do in waking life. And actually, it's an indication. Again, it's not literal. It's not that we must do that exact thing, but it actually, what is the energy? What is the energy of what that shadowy part in the dream is doing that actually in waking life we might want to integrate into our lives. So dream work is also quite a useful tool. But circling back to the emotional reactivity, I also, as self-awareness, I think mindfulness is a great tool as well. Just when we notice that reactivity, just to be able to be still and tune in and just really ask ourselves what's going on here and just see what comes up, right? And journaling around that, what's coming up. And with that goes self-compassion. Right. It's just
Yeah.
actually this is hard work. And so we need to be compassionate for the part of us that had the story that meant that we're having the experience right now, but also be compassionate that actually it might be hard to make change and just acknowledging the difficulty of that. So I think, self-compassion is also super important as well. And finally, I would say with shadow work, but just coming back to that lazy analogy, it's once we've kind of begin to think of what's going on here, that kind of curiosity, and we're willing to say, maybe I am like that, maybe I'm like that. It's not about literally becoming the other person. It's just saying, what are the qualities? I said, a lazy person perhaps may overly rest, but the point being is the essence is maybe they know how to rest. And that's the thing. How do I incorporate that in my life? Someone who's perhaps got more controlling energy. Again, it's not that we go around controlling people, but what's the essence? You know, maybe I have a determination to get things. Is there something I want in my life that actually I'm not allowing myself to have because I feel I'm not entitled to have it, right? So it's more the energy or the little seeds in that. We don't become the whole bush that they are, but it's what's the seed. When am I not allowing myself to be entitled to certain things? And do I feel I'm not entitled and so shrink?
Right.
That's it. It's just looking for the little seeds. You're not becoming them. You're not them. But what are the seeds that perhaps have become distorted in that other person? That's no way of saying it. It's the same seed. Maybe the way they have manifested it is the opposite end of, I suppose we're looking for the middle ground, right? If they're kind of too, overly controlling, very dominant, but we're finding ourselves very passive, those are the two extremes of the same thing, which is being able to, the healthy way would be to assert, the healthy way would be to influence. the healthy thing would be to speak what's on one's mind calmly, clearly, respectfully. And I suppose there's a distortion either way. And so it's like, what's that middle place, trying to kind of excavate and find that seed.
You're talking a lot about energy in the way that you're describing things, and I really like that. I think that's really helpful because I don't hear a lot of people talk about that, to be honest. I think it's really, really relevant and really real and really important. And we all kind of sense it, it's like
Mm.
sometimes you're like, something's not sitting right for me. And it's an energy. Can't put my finger on it. And so I guess my question is, how do we trust that? Because I've gone through periods in my life where I'm like, I'm very in tune, and you seem very like an in tune person. And then I've been through times where I've kind of lost it and have fallen off that in tune wagon. How do we come back to that, trusting that energetic feeling?
I think it's always about bringing it back to self, right? Because we can have a open-hearted, loving energy where we trust the other person's intention. But I think we always need to bring it back to I mean, I think a lot of trusting ourselves is just really about listening to ourselves, right? It's a daily practice. I think, maybe sometimes what we do is we leave it until those kind of bigger moments. And I think actually developing a sense of self-trust is about a daily practice of being self-aware, whether that is about journaling. Then we can track things, right? We can track things more about, when was I off? When did I misread those signals?
Right.
When did I get things right? Instead of waiting for the moment when I don't know, we're having a date or we're meeting someone for the first time, and then our system has to be on or off. Do I trust this person or don't? And I think actually it's more just of a gradual daily practice of showing up for ourselves, noticing. Just we can notice all kinds of interactions during the day because, as you said earlier, we are always in relationship. Whether we're going to buy something from the supermarket, whether it's at work, family members. And so we don't just need to notice these things with our intimate partner. We can notice it all day with everybody. I mean, it all comes back to really that relationship with ourselves. There'll be an origin story about, in our past somewhere, I imagine, about why it feels that we can't trust ourselves. Did people tell us that, uh, you can't be trusted, which can be subtle. I mean, it can be literally someone said that. Or if we have a overcompensating parent that's always doing things for us, then we lose trust that we can do things for ourselves, right? Because someone's always stepping in to kind of rescue us and do things for us. We don't have the confidence that actually I can judge this. I can judge this. So I think it's all a practice about reconnecting to oneself.
So once we reconnect to ourselves, then we can be kind of more equipped to practice intimacy and notice. Really, it's just kind of it feels like a level of reaching a new level of self awareness, because that's the only way you can really be responsible for your own stuff.
One can only be responsible for, our own stuff. And it's, as I said, it also gives the opportunity to witness somebody else's stuff, to have your stuff witnessed. And within that, you'll be able to create something that feels more open and spacious and loving. So paradoxically, I think a lot of relationship work is about inner self work and at the same time holding the relationship in context. That's why conflict in relationship can be quite useful when it's healthily expressed, because it's bringing all your triggers to the surface. And if we step away, that all those triggers are not just about the person standing in front of me.
Right.
They may, that actually they're playing a part, and it might be a huge part, it might be a smaller part, but nonetheless, it's a part. Then it's an opportunity to bring it's all that stuff comes to the surface, and then we have an opportunity to deal with it and decide how we want to deal with it and what we want to do. And you know, it might mean that we double down and recommit to the relationship we're in. It might mean that we've denied or ignored things in the relationship because that's been our conditioning. And so, maybe our work is to leave it.
Right.
Maybe that is the work, right? But nonetheless, um, it allows us to do it more consciousness as opposed to reactivity. And then what happens, because when we do things in reactivity, particularly when we end relationships, we end up recreating the same or having the same experiences, picking a similar kind of person and going through the same heartache again. And so it's a good opportunity, I think, relationships.
Sandra, this has been really incredible. I love that kind of the underlying message of this is go back to self. Always go back to self. That's so useful. Thank you. Just before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would want to impart on ways that we're blocking intimacy and ways that we can open up? I feel like we've covered a lot. Is there anything last little things that you'd like to share with us?
I think maybe just to reiterate that, this is a practice. It's not an on-off switch. And so self-compassion, patience, practice, gratitude for yourself, and others. I think they're good key parts, and just a recognition that the challenges you have in the relationship are likely not your fault. We carry much from earlier years into our relationships. One, two, it's deeply unconscious. So unless you know how to do this stuff, how would you? And no one teaches us this stuff when
No,
no
they
one
do
teaches
not.
us how to be in the relationships, or we would have had this image is actually, what does intimacy mean? If we've never seen our parents hold hands, say something nice or kind or loving to each other, then what does that internalize? So I think a good dose of self-compassion is what I would leave you with.
I feel like we've opened a bit of a box now. I do want to get into that because I had this conversation with an ex of mine. I mean, intimacy means a lot of things, but the physical touch is a big part of it for me personally. But I know that
Mm.
it's not a big part of it for everyone. And we were talking about that, and he was saying, "Oh well, physical touch is not the only way of intimacy." And I was like, "Yeah, of course, but what are the other ways?" And what would you say? So, what are some ways? You've mentioned a few already. Being open, being vulnerable, sharing, seeing the other person. But what are some other ways that actually are intimate?
Well, it might be eye contact, isn't it? I think a lot of couples do find it difficult to look each other in the eye,
Right.
you know. And it might just be a subtle glance when you're out somewhere and your partner's uncomfortable, and you just give a glance that says, "I've got you." Right? It can be very subtle things. It can be, I suppose, along on the lines of the love languages. I mean, it can be a gift, right? It can be a gift that lets you know that someone's listened to me or remembered something, something that you might have said last year, year before, and this person has remembered, right? So I think there are lots of, small different ways that actually, intimacy it can be a note on the fridge, right? It can be a routines or rituals you have as a
Give me a loving, longing look.
yeah.
Well, Sandra,
Yeah.
thank you so much for being here. This has just
Yeah.
been such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
If people want to get in touch with you and find out about what you do, how can they do that?
Okay, so you can most of my platforms are under Sandra Harewood.
Hmm.
So my website is under my name, Sandra Harewood. The actual website is sdhcounselling.co.uk. I'm based in the UK. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook also, and you can find me under the name of Sandra Harewood Counselling. So what I also have on my website is a quiz. So it's to find out your relationship archetype. So your archetype is a combination of your persona, which is the how you are, how you show up in normal day-to-day life, but it also lets you know the other part of it is a shadow. right? And so I've got a quiz that can let you know what your relationship archetype is. So you can kind of begin to figure out where your shadow might be showing up in your life and in your relationship. So you can find that on my website.
Thank you so much for being here. You're
That's
such a gem.
okay.
This has been a lovely conversation. I appreciate
Thank
you.
you so much. Okay, thank you so much.
This podcast is a Rebel Love production. To find the links mentioned in this episode, go to rebellove.com/let love begin. That was awesome. You've got such a soothing voice. Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
have I? Oh, thank you.